The Forgotten Christmas Ornament. Mary Whitfield sat quietly in her favorite armchair, the soft ticking of the clock on the mantel, the only sound breaking the silence of the room. Outside the large bay window, snow fell gently, blanketing her small garden in a thick layer of white. It was December 20th, just a few days before Christmas, but the house showed no sign of the holiday spirit. No twinkling lights adorned the windows, no wreath hung on the door, and most notably, no Christmas tree stood in the corner of the living room where it once had every year. Mary sighed, wrapping her cardigan more tightly around her shoulders. The house felt too quiet these days. It was an old Victorian-style home with creaking floors and wide, empty rooms that seemed to echo the absence of laughter and chatter. Once, it had been filled to the brim with joy during the holiday season. Children's voices had filled the air, along with the smell of freshly baked gingerbread and the sound of carols being sung around the piano. But those days felt like a distant dream now. Her 3 children, grown and with families of their own, had moved to different parts of the country, too busy to visit this year. The old home had become a place of solitude, and Mary found herself spending more time lost in thought, looking out at the snow-covered landscape and remembering. There was no real reason to decorate anymore, she thought. It had been years since she'd even set up a Christmas tree. What would be the point, with no one here to see it? She closed her eyes, trying to push away the heaviness in her chest, but memories of past Christmases flooded in unbidden. She saw her husband, Henry, carefully hanging the delicate glass ornaments on the tree, each one catching the light and casting tiny rainbows across the walls. She could hear the laughter of her children as they scrambled to find their favorite decorations. A tiny porcelain angel, a glittering reindeer, and a small, shabby felt Santa that had always held a special place of honor at the top of the tree. That tree had stood like a beacon of warmth and love in the center of their lives, and the house had never felt the same without it. A sudden, inexplicable urge struck her then. Mary stood up, surprising herself with the suddenness of her decision. Perhaps, she thought, just this once, she could look at the old ornaments again. Even if she didn't set up a tree, she could take them out, just to remember. A trip down memory lane, she told herself. Maybe it would bring a little comfort. Slowly, Mary made her way to the narrow staircase that led up to the attic. The stairs creaked under her weight as she climbed, the air growing cooler and mustier as she reached the top. She hadn't been up here in years. It was a cluttered, dusty space filled with old furniture, boxes of knickknacks, and remnants of a life that had once been bustling and busy. Cobwebs hung like tinsel in the corners, and the dim light from the single overhead bulb flickered faintly. She paused at the threshold, hesitating. It felt strange, as if by stepping into the attic, she was crossing into another time, one where laughter echoed through the hallways and the scent of pine filled the air. But she took a deep breath and stepped forward, her eyes scanning the stacks of boxes and old trunks. It took a few moments of shuffling things around, but then she spotted it. An old, slightly battered cardboard box pushed into a corner, almost hidden behind an old rocking chair. It was covered in a fine layer of dust, and Mary had to brush it off gently, coughing as the particles swirled in the cold attic air. Her heart gave a small, unexpected flutter when she saw the faded handwriting on the top of the box. Christmas Memories, it read in looping script, her own handwriting from so many years ago. She traced the words with her fingertips, a flood of emotions rushing through her. Slowly, reverently, Mary lifted the lid, half expecting the contents to have disintegrated with age. But everything was just as she remembered. A tangle of colored lights, the kind that blinked on and off in soft patterns, lay coiled at the top. Beneath them were layers of carefully wrapped ornaments, each one nestled in old newspaper for safekeeping. She pulled out a small, delicate figurine, a glass angel with a tiny, serene smile and shimmering wings. It caught the light just so, and Mary felt a sharp pang of nostalgia, the sight of it pulling her back to a different time. She turned the angel over in her hands, remembering the day she had bought it. It had been their first Christmas in this house, back when the children were still small and Henry had still been alive. They'd spent a whole afternoon wandering through the Christmas market, looking for the perfect decorations. This angel had caught her eye, sparkling under the strings of lights. Henry had laughed at her enthusiasm, but he'd bought it for her anyway, and she had placed it carefully at the top of the tree, where it watched over their little family year after year. Tears prickled at the corners of her eyes, and she blinked them away quickly. What was she doing? Sifting through old ornaments, remembering things that would only make her miss them more? She should close the box and go back downstairs. Forget she'd ever come up here. But her hands moved on their own, unwrapping more ornaments, each one a key to a memory long tucked away. There was the tiny sleigh, painted in red and gold, that her son Jack had insisted on placing on the lowest branch every year so he could reach it himself. There was the star her daughter Lila had made in kindergarten, its lopsided points and glittery surface still intact. And the felt Santa, so worn and faded now, sat at the bottom, his beady eyes still twinkling up at her. A soft smile tugged at her lips. She had been so afraid of losing these treasures over the years, but they had stayed safe, preserved in this forgotten corner of her attic. A thought struck her suddenly. Maybe, just maybe, she could bring them out one last time. Not for anyone else, but for herself. To remember and to honor all the Christmases they had shared. Mary glanced around the dim, dusty attic, feeling a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe it was hope, or maybe it was just a flicker of the old Christmas spirit, stirring to life once more. With a resolve that surprised even her, she carefully closed the box and picked it up. It was heavier than she remembered, but she held it tightly, as if afraid it might disappear if she let go. Slowly, she made her way back down the stairs, the box cradled in her arms like something precious. Back in the living room, the silence didn't feel quite so empty. Mary set the box down gently on the coffee table and took a deep breath. Perhaps it was time to bring a little Christmas back into the house. Not for the children, not for the neighbors, but for herself. She deserved that much, didn't she? With a trembling hand, she reached into the box and pulled out the first ornament, the glass angel, its tiny wings catching the soft glow of the lamp. She would start with this one, she decided. Just this one, to see how it felt. Mary hung the angel on a small branch of the bare pine tree she'd almost forgotten she had brought inside last week. As she stepped back to look at it, The room seemed to grow warmer, the shadows receding just a little, and for the first time in years, Mary felt a small, tentative smile spread across her face. It was a beginning, a small one, but a beginning nonetheless. Mary stood back, hands clasped in front of her, staring at the tiny angel ornament. It looked small and fragile against the bare branches of the pine tree she'd set up, its delicate wings glimmering in the soft light of the room. For a moment, she just looked at it, wondering why such a simple decoration could stir up so much emotion. But it wasn't just the ornament, she realized. It was what it represented. A time when life was fuller, a time when this house was bursting with love and laughter. Taking a deep breath, Mary reached into the box again. Her fingers brushed against something soft, and she gently pulled out a small, faded red velvet pouch. The material felt almost velvety under her touch, worn down by years of handling. She carefully opened it, her breath catching as she drew out a small, glittering snowflake made of crystal. Each tiny facet caught the light, casting tiny rainbows across her living room wall. Holding it brought back a flood of memories, and Mary closed her eyes, letting them wash over her. She could see it so clearly. A Christmas Eve long ago, back when her children were small, and Henry was still by her side. The snow had been falling thick and fast outside, covering the world in a blanket of white. Mary had just tucked the children into bed, reading them a story about snow fairies and magic Christmas nights. Stay up too late, and you might just see them dancing on the tree, she'd whispered with a wink, knowing full well it would keep them peeking out from under their blankets for hours. That night, Henry had presented her with the snowflake ornament, slipping it into her hand with a grin. "For our own little bit of magic," he'd said. They'd placed it high up on the tree, right in the center, where it could catch the light. It had become a tradition every year after that. The snowflake always took its place of honor on their tree, sparkling and shining as if it truly were enchanted. But the last time Mary had seen it, the snowflake had been hanging from a tiny branch on the tree in Henry's hospital room. The sight of it, so small, so beautiful, against the sterile white walls, had broken her heart. She had clung to that ornament in the days after his passing, but somehow, somewhere along the way, she'd packed it away, unable to bear looking at it again. Now, holding it in her hands once more, she felt a mix of sorrow and something else, something warmer. The memory wasn't just sad. It was filled with love, with the memory of the joy they'd shared, even in those dark days. "Maybe it's time," she murmured softly, almost as if speaking to Henry. "Maybe it's time to bring the magic back." With trembling hands, Mary stepped closer to the tree. She hesitated for a moment, then reached up, finding a branch that was just the right height. She placed the snowflake carefully, making sure it was centered just so. When she stepped back, the crystal caught the light from the lamp beside her, and the room seemed to sparkle, as if the snowflake really was casting some kind of magic spell. For a long moment, Mary simply stood there, lost in thought. Then she took a deep breath and turned back to the box. There were more ornaments to uncover, and each one, she knew, would bring with it another memory. But she wasn't afraid of them anymore. No matter how bittersweet, these memories were all part of her life, part of the love that had filled this house for so many years. The next ornament she pulled out was a small, painted sleigh, red with gold trim, just as she remembered it. Jack had always insisted on placing it himself, right at the bottom of the tree. It was a sturdy little decoration, not as delicate as some of the others, which made it perfect for a rambunctious little boy who couldn't keep his hands off the tree. "Please, Mama, let me do it," he'd beg every year, his eyes shining with excitement. And Mary would always let him, watching as his tiny hands placed it oh so carefully on the lowest branch, where he could admire it every day. As she looked at it now, a smile spread across her face. She could almost hear Jack's voice, full of the energy and enthusiasm of childhood. Slowly, she placed the sleigh at the bottom of the tree, just like Jack used to. It felt right, somehow, like honoring a small but precious tradition. "There," she whispered softly, just like always. One by one, Mary continued to unpack the ornaments. Each one was wrapped in old, yellowing tissue paper, carefully stored away with love. There were glass baubles in every color of the rainbow. Their bright hues faded a little with time. There was a tiny porcelain Santa, his paint chipped, but his smile still cheerful, and a set of miniature candy canes that had once hung from every branch. But then her fingers brushed against something small and soft, something that wasn't an ornament at all. Curiously, Mary pulled it out, feeling the lightness of the fabric in her hands. It was a tiny stocking, no bigger than her hand, made of red felt with a white cuff. Mary's breath caught as she turned it over, and there, stitched in uneven childish letters, was her youngest daughter's name, Lila. The sight of it nearly undid her. Lila had been so small when she'd made this, her little fingers struggling to hold the needle steady. She'd been so proud when she finished it, presenting it to Mary with a beaming smile. "For Santa," she'd said, her eyes wide with excitement. They'd hung it on the tree every year, even as Lila grew older, until it seemed too childish, and Lila had laughingly declared it was time to retire her little stocking. Mary held it to her chest for a moment, feeling the fabric warm in her hands. Then, with a smile, she found a branch right in the center of the tree and hung it there. "For Santa," she murmured, remembering the bright-eyed little girl her daughter had once been. Each ornament she uncovered told a story. There was the wooden nutcracker her husband had carved by hand when their eldest son was born, the tiny tin soldier that had been a gift from her own parents, and, at the very bottom of the box, the felt Santa, so worn and faded now, his red coat almost pink with age. "Old friend," she said softly, holding the tiny figure in her hand. Santa's beady black eyes looked up at her, and Mary felt a pang of affection. This ornament had been on every tree she could remember, even when she was a little girl. It had been passed down from her grandmother, a cherished keepsake of Christmases long past. With gentle care, she placed the Santa at the top of the tree, just like she used to. The house felt warmer now, the quiet no longer as oppressive. The tree, though still mostly bare, glowed softly in the lamplight, each ornament a bright spot of color against the green needles. "Almost like old times," she whispered, stepping back to look at it. There were still so many ornaments left in the box, so many memories yet to be uncovered. But she felt lighter somehow, more at peace. Maybe it wasn't just about remembering what was gone, she thought. Maybe it was about honoring what still remained, the love, the joy, and the spirit of Christmas that had always been a part of her life. Slowly, Mary sank back into her armchair, the box of ornaments at her feet. There was no rush. She would take her time, savoring each memory as it came. For now, she was content to sit and look at the tree, watching the way the lights danced across the delicate glass and wood. The Christmas spirit wasn't gone, she realized. It had just been waiting, tucked away like an old box in the attic, ready to be uncovered again. With each delicate ornament that Mary unwrapped, memories unfurled around her like pages of a cherished book. As if each bauble, each glittering trinket, held not just its shape and color, but the echoes of laughter, the warmth of embraces, and the melody of voices that had filled her home for so many years. She felt herself being drawn deeper into the past, each ornament a thread that wove a tapestry of Christmases gone by, reminding her of both the sweetness and the sadness of times passing. She pulled out a small, gold-painted pine cone next, its surface slightly worn, but still glimmering in the soft light. Henry had found it on one of their long-ago winter walks through the woods that bordered their home. They had been young then, newly married, and filled with dreams of the life they were building together. She could still remember the way he'd bent down, picking up the pine cone and dusting the snow off its tiny scales. "Look at this," he'd said, holding it out to her with a boyish grin. "Isn't it perfect? It's like a little treasure." They had brought it home and painted it gold together, laughing as they dripped paint onto the kitchen table and ended up with smudges of gold on their faces. That pine cone had been the very first ornament they'd made together, a symbol of the new traditions they were starting. Mary's throat tightened as she held it up to the light, the faint traces of their fingerprints still visible beneath the paint. With great care, she found a place for it on the tree, letting it dangle gently from a low branch where it could catch the glow of the room. The next ornament she unwrapped was a miniature rocking horse, painted bright red with white accents on its saddle. As she held it, she couldn't help but smile, the image of her son Daniel flashing before her eyes. He had been just 3 years old, bouncing with excitement, when they had gone to pick out a Christmas tree that year. Henry had hoisted him onto his shoulders, and Daniel had pointed with glee at the tallest, bushiest tree in the lot. "That one, Papa," he'd squealed, his little hands clutching Henry's hat. "The big one. I want the big one." They had laughed and shaken their heads, knowing there was no way they could fit such a tree into their tiny living room. But Daniel had been adamant, his face set in that stubborn expression that meant he wouldn't budge until they gave in. In the end, they had compromised on a slightly smaller tree, though it had still been far too big, and spent the rest of the evening trimming branches and rearranging furniture just to make it fit. The rocking horse had been a gift that Christmas, a tiny replica of the full-sized one Henry had built for Daniel in the workshop. Daniel had ridden that rocking horse every day for years, his little legs kicking back and forth as he pretended to race through snowy fields and over imaginary mountains. Now, as Mary hung the miniature rocking horse on the tree, she felt the familiar tug of loss. Daniel, her brave and adventurous boy, was now a grown man with children of his own, living miles away. But alongside the sadness, there was joy too. The joy of remembering the little boy he had been, so full of life and laughter. The rocking horse swayed gently on its branch, and Mary whispered softly, Merry Christmas, my darling. I hope you still remember the magic." Next came a delicate silver bell, small enough to fit in the palm of her hand. Mary brushed a finger across its smooth surface, her breath catching as it let out a faint, tinkling chime. Lila had been just a baby when they'd added this bell to their collection. It had been Henry's idea, a way to commemorate their daughter's first Christmas. "She's too little to remember this," Mary had protested as Henry insisted on buying the bell from a small shop downtown. But Henry had just smiled, his eyes twinkling. "It's not for her to remember," he'd said. "It's for us, so we can look back and remember what it felt like to have our whole family together." And they had hung the bell on the tree that year, its chime ringing softly in the stillness of the house whenever the tree shifted. Each time Mary had heard it, she'd felt a surge of love so powerful it had almost overwhelmed her. Love for her children, love for Henry, and love for the little family they had built together. Lila had grown up with that bell as a part of every Christmas, its delicate chime marking the years as she went from a wide-eyed baby to a curious toddler, to a serious little girl who loved to sit in front of the fire and listen to Mary read Christmas stories. Now, as Mary hung the bell on the tree, she gave it a gentle tap, watching as it swayed and rang softly in the quiet room. The sound was as clear and bright as ever, filling the air with a sense of wonder and peace. More ornaments followed, each one bringing with it a new memory. There was the wooden toy soldier Henry had carved by hand for Jack's first Christmas, its paint chipped and worn from years of use. She remembered the way Jack's eyes had lit up when he'd opened it, clutching it to his chest and declaring it his special Christmas guard. Then there was the fragile glass star that had always topped their tree, its points delicate and sharp. They had bought it the year Mary was pregnant with Lila, choosing it together as a symbol of hope for their growing family. The star had shattered once, a long time ago, when a stray snowball from the boys had knocked it off its perch. Henry had spent an entire evening painstakingly gluing the pieces back together, muttering softly under his breath the whole time. It hadn't been perfect afterward, but they had hung it up every year nonetheless, each crack and flaw a testament to the love and care that had held their family together through every challenge. Mary traced a finger along the uneven lines of the star, feeling the tiny ridges of the glue beneath her fingertips. How many times had they stood around the tree, holding hands as they placed it on top, one of the children on Henry's shoulders, to reach the highest branches. The memory was so vivid, it almost hurt, and for a moment, Mary felt tears prick at her eyes. But she didn't let them fall. Instead, she carefully placed the star in its rightful place, right at the top of the tree, and stepped back to admire the way it caught the light. "Still beautiful," she murmured, smiling softly, just like always. The final ornament in the box was wrapped in a thick layer of tissue paper, and Mary hesitated as she reached for it, a strange sense of anticipation building in her chest. She knew what it was even before she unwrapped it. She had saved it for last, as she always did. It was the one ornament that was more than just a decoration. It was a symbol of everything Christmas had meant to their family. Slowly, she peeled away the paper, revealing the small, handmade felt Santa that had been a part of her Christmases for as long as she could remember. His tiny black eyes stared up at her, his red suit faded, and his white beard now a soft gray. The sight of him made her smile, the ache in her chest easing just a little. This Santa had been on every Christmas tree she'd ever known. Her grandmother's tree, her mother's tree, and then her own. He was a little worse for wear now, but that didn't matter. He was still here, just like her. Still holding on, still bringing a bit of joy to the holiday, even after all these years. The soft glow of the tree filled the room with a gentle, comforting light as Mary reached for the very last item left in the box. Her heart gave a little flutter as her fingers brushed against the smooth, cool surface of a small wooden case. She knew exactly what it held without even opening it. This was not just any ornament. It was the ornament, the family star that had topped their Christmas tree every year since the children were small. For a long moment, she simply held the case in her hands, running her fingers over the familiar grain of the wood. The star inside had always been special. It wasn't the most elaborate or expensive ornament they owned, but it held more meaning than any of the others. Mary's father had carved it by hand when she was a little girl, spending long, quiet evenings in his workshop, whittling and sanding until it was perfect. When he'd given it to her, he'd placed it in this very box, telling her that it was a symbol of hope and love, a light to guide them through the darkest nights of the year. Mary's family had hung that star on the top of their tree every year, no matter where they lived or how little they had. It had been a constant, a bright and steady light that shone down on their holiday gatherings, a beacon of joy and togetherness. And when she'd married Henry, her father had given her the star, saying it was time for her to start her own traditions. She and Henry had continued the custom, placing the star on the top of their tree every Christmas Eve, surrounded by their children. But that tradition had ended the year Henry died. Mary remembered it clearly, the emptiness she had felt that first Christmas without him, the way she had stood in front of the bare tree, holding the star in her hands and feeling utterly lost. She hadn't been able to bring herself to place it on the tree. Instead, she'd put it back in the case and tucked it away in the attic, as if hiding it could somehow hide the pain. Now, all these years later, she could hardly believe she was holding it again. Slowly, Mary opened the lid, her breath catching as the star's polished surface gleamed softly in the lamplight. It was just as she remembered, simple but beautiful, with smooth lines and gently curved edges. The wood was warm to the touch, almost as if it were alive, and she could still see the faint traces of her father's careful carving, the tiny marks that only a craftsman would notice. Tears welled up in her eyes as she traced the shape of the star, her fingers lingering over each point, each delicate curve. This star had been a part of her family's Christmas for generations. It had shone down on so many joyful moments. Children opening presents, carols being sung around the piano, laughter and love filling the air. It had been there through the good times and the hard times, always a reminder that no matter what happened, they were still a family. But what did it mean now, in this empty house, with no one left to gather around it? Could it still be a symbol of hope when there was no one here to see it? Mary's hand trembled slightly as she lifted the star from its case, holding it carefully, almost reverently. For a moment, she considered putting it back. maybe it was better to leave it in the box, to keep it safe and preserved, just as she had for all these years. But then she glanced at the tree. It stood there, softly glowing, its branches adorned with the ornaments of her past. The tiny rocking horse, the crystal snowflake, the little stocking with Lila's name. Each one a piece of her family, each one a memory of love and joy that hadn't faded, even after all this time. And suddenly, she realized that the star belonged here too. It wasn't just a symbol of what was lost. It was a reminder of what had been, of all the beautiful moments that had filled her life, and of the love that still lingered, even now. With a deep breath, Mary stepped forward, the star cradled carefully in her hands. She reached up, standing on tiptoe to place it at the very top of the tree, just as she had so many times before. Her hands shook slightly as she adjusted it, making sure it was perfectly centered. Then she stepped back, her heart pounding as she looked up at it. The star seemed to glow with its own light, a soft, warm radiance that filled the room. It cast tiny patterns of shadow and light across the walls, its points shimmering like tiny beacons in the dimness. And as Mary watched, she felt something shift inside her, something that had been locked away for a long, long time. The heaviness in her chest lifted, just a little, replaced by a warmth that spread through her like a gentle flame. It was hope, she realized. The star still held its power. It still symbolized everything it always had: love, family, the strength to carry on, even when the world seemed dark and cold. It was a light in the darkness, a promise that there was always something worth holding on to. Mary's vision blurred as tears filled her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. Instead, she let them fall, each one a tiny release of the grief and loneliness she had carried for so long. "Henry," she whispered softly, looking up at the star. "Do you see? I put it up, just like always." The room was silent, but it didn't feel empty. The tree seemed to glow brighter, as if responding to her words, and for the first time in years, Mary felt truly at peace. She could almost imagine Henry standing beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his voice low and warm in her ear. "Beautiful job, love," he would have said. "It looks perfect." And maybe, just maybe, he was still there, in some small way. Maybe all the people she had loved and lost, her parents, Henry, the children who had grown up and moved away, were still a part of this moment. They were there in the ornaments, in the memories, in the love that had filled this house for so many years. The star, shining softly at the top of the tree, was a reminder that they were still connected, still bound together by the unbreakable threads of family and tradition. "Thank you," Mary whispered, her voice trembling. "Thank you for all the beautiful Christmases, for everything." The star didn't answer, but it didn't need to. Its gentle light was enough. Mary wiped her eyes and took a deep breath, letting the peace of the moment wash over her. This Christmas might not be like the ones she'd had before. It might be quieter, lonelier, but it was still Christmas, and the love and memories that filled her heart were still real. And that was enough, more than enough. With a final, lingering look at the glowing star, Mary turned away from the tree. She moved slowly around the room, turning off the lamps one by one, letting the tree's soft radiance fill the space. The house was silent, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with light and warmth, and as Mary made her way to her chair, She felt a sense of calm settle over her. She sat down, gazing at the tree with a small, contented smile. "Merry Christmas," she whispered softly, her eyes on the star. "Merry Christmas, everyone." The tree glimmered gently in response, its lights twinkling like tiny stars. And in that quiet, glowing room, Mary felt surrounded by love, by the past, by the present, and by the promise of all the Christmases still to come. As Mary sat back in her chair, the warm glow of the tree enveloping her in its soft light, she felt a calm she hadn't experienced in years. The house, once filled with the echoes of empty silence, now hummed quietly with a gentle, almost magical energy. It was as if every ornament, every light, and every branch of the tree was alive with the memories and love that had filled her life for so many Christmases. For the first time in what seemed like forever, Mary didn't feel alone. She felt surrounded by her family, by her past, and by the spirit of Christmas. Lost in her thoughts, she didn't notice the sound of tires crunching on the snow outside, or the soft murmur of voices drifting up the porch steps. It wasn't until the front door creaked open, a gust of cold air swirling into the warm room, that she looked up, startled. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw a familiar face peeking around the doorframe. "Mom?" It was Lila, bundled up in a heavy coat and scarf, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Her voice was soft, tentative, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. Are you really here?" And Lila's gaze shifted to the tree, her eyes widening. Did you put up the tree?" Before Mary could respond, another voice called from behind her daughter. "Grandma!" It was one of her grandchildren, followed by another, and then another, tumbling into the room in a flurry of laughter and excitement. "We're here. We're finally here." And then they were all there, filling the room. Her children, her grandchildren, all bundled in scarves and hats, their eyes shining with warmth and happiness. Mary stood slowly, her hand pressed to her chest, her heart racing with a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming joy. What are you doing here?" she managed, her voice trembling. I thought you weren't coming this year." Lila stepped forward, her eyes misty with emotion. "We weren't going to, but..." She glanced around at her siblings, smiling softly. "We couldn't stand the thought of you being alone on Christmas. So we changed our plans, and here we are. We wanted to surprise you." A tear slipped down Mary's cheek, and she quickly wiped it away, shaking her head in amazement. You came all this way, just for me?" "Of course we did, Mom," Jack said gently, wrapping her in a warm embrace. "We couldn't let Christmas go by without being together." The room seemed to blur as her children took turns hugging her, each embrace filling the empty spaces in her heart. Mary's arms ached with the joy of holding them close, the familiar scent of their coats, the sound of their laughter. It was almost too much, too beautiful to bear. And then the grandchildren were there too, tugging at her hands, chattering excitedly as they pointed at the tree. "Grandma, look, you decorated it just like you used to. Can we help finish it? Please?" Mary looked at the tree, the ornaments still scattered in the box at her feet, and then back at the eager, hopeful faces surrounding her. She felt a smile spread slowly across her face, wider and brighter than any smile she had given in years. "Yes," she whispered, her voice soft and full of love. "Yes, of course. Let's finish it together." With that, the house came alive. Voices filled the air. mingling with the soft strains of Christmas carols playing from the old record player in the corner. The children giggled and chattered as they handed her ornaments, their little hands carefully placing each one on the branches. Her own children joined in, sharing stories of past Christmases, their voices blending into a warm, familiar melody of family. Mary stepped back, watching them all, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. The tree was glowing brightly now, every branch adorned with ornaments, every light twinkling softly. And at the very top, the family star shone down on them, its light casting a gentle, golden glow over the room. "Merry Christmas, everyone," Mary whispered softly, tears of joy slipping down her cheeks. Her family turned, smiling at her, their eyes shining with love. "Merry Christmas, Mom," they echoed, and Mary felt it, truly felt it. The warmth, the hope, the love that she had thought she'd lost. Her house was full again, her heart overflowing. It wasn't just the decorations or the tree that made it Christmas. It was this, her family, together, sharing laughter and love. And for Mary, that was the greatest Christmas gift of all.